So we want to get started with a bit of logistics and overview. My name is Dr. Tanya Matthews. I am the Director of Inclusion here at the American Alliance of Museums, and I am supported this afternoon by Brooke Leonard, our Chief of Staff, and I must say that given the overwhelming response, we brought some extra folks into the room. So our head of IT is also with us this afternoon. If my screen goes blank, I'll give you his email address. And we also have Alexandra here, who is our primary project manager for this program at the moment. So what we're going to do is we are going to be taking questions throughout the presentation and answering them as they make sense. Sometimes the questions will preview what we're talking about. Sometimes they will be appropriate to answer in real time. And we also, of course, have a question and answer section at the end. I want to thank everyone who sent questions in advance. They actually helped us design the presentation this afternoon and highlighted some of the things that we needed to talk about. This session is being recorded, and the audio as well as the PowerPoint will be available after we have completed. So if there's something you missed, or more importantly, something you'd like to share, this will be available for you to do so on our website. Like any good grand project, we've got acronyms. I will do my best to reiterate them in real time. But the three major acronyms that we'll be using, of course, will be AAM, the American Alliance of Museums, DEAI, Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion, and our new acronym for the day will be MCOL, our Museum Communities of Learning. I'm going to start with a brief introduction into the American Alliance of Museums. We know that some of our participants are not actually as familiar with the Alliance because we have opened this invitation to professionals in DEAI as well as nonprofit professionals across the board. I'm going to highlight a little bit of what it took for us to get into this space, some of the preliminary reports that helped us decide where our first initiative was going to go, highlight the charge of facing the change, and then describe the fellowship itself. And we will have questions and answers, which hopefully will help all of you with your applications and create even more interest and excitement than we already have. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to AAM. We are one of the largest, most comprehensive organizations representing museums in the world. Our vision is to have a world that's more informed and more enriched by thriving museums. Our charge, we champion museums and nurture excellence with our members and our allies. I'm also delivering greetings from our CEO, who is shown in the picture to the right, with her family at one of our museum institutions. We support more than 35,000 museum professionals and museums from A to Z. Art museums, sister museums, science centers, zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, and all the other types of museums that are fulfilling the sector and engaging the minds of our community all over our country. As a matter of fact, we just concluded our Advocacy Day here in Washington, D.C., where several hundred museum professionals joined us to come and talk to our congressmen and women about the role, the importance of museums, and what it takes to keep us going. And I will say that despite everything else that is happening here in Washington, D.C., the museum folks always seem to be welcome. So we are very excited about that. And so it is one of the larger scale programs that we do. In that category of what we do, the American Alliance of Museums accredits, advocates, connects, educates, and puts forth strategic foresight for museums. We are the primary accreditation body for our sector, and our sister organizations have additional and supporting accreditations as well. We advocate for museums, as mentioned. We just finished our annual Advocacy Day, but for us it is a year-long process of testifying and noting and educating and championing the roles of museums. We connect ourselves to each other as well as to our community, and the same can be said for our educational footprint. And we offer strategic insight, not only into the challenges that we are currently facing, but to the challenges that we may soon face. The Alliance, like every good organization, is indeed powered by our strategic plan. And as I'm noting documents that we have available on our website, I'm embedding the link right here in this presentation so that after this conversation, if you'd like to check those materials out for yourself, you can. Our strategic plan is powered by our what we do: accredit, advocate, connect, educate, and provide strategic foresight. And the what we do are powered by our how and our why. So for accreditation, this is when we're talking about our continuum of excellence, as I know many participants on this phone call are already participants in. Advocacy, global thinking, access, all having educational access to what we provide, as well as helping our sector provide universal access to the education and the cultural materials that we steward, and strategic foresight. All of our what we do is powered by our how and our why, and those are our focus areas. Our three focus areas for the current strategic plan, reading from the bottom up: P through 12 education, that would be preschool, 12th grade education; financial sustainability for ourselves as well as for our sector; and diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Each of these focus areas is run through each of the 5 pillars. And so today, as we talk about the Facing Change initiative, of course, we are talking about the focus area of diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. DEAI has always been at the core of AAM's work, but as we will talk about this is a trajectory and a very long work, and we ourselves have been working on DEAI internally as well as being able to champion it throughout the field. And so this is what leads us to where we are today in terms of launching the major initiative of Facing Change. And some of the questions that we received leading up to this presentation really wanted to dig into how we got there. So a couple of quick notes. So where we are as a sector, and when I say as a sector, I mean to the museum community as a whole. So we are businesses, nonprofit, still business, for-profit, still business, and we know that high-performing organizations must have the right people. And what we have become much more sophisticated about is that when we say right people at the helm, we mean folks of different and complementary backgrounds and experiences. Diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion are required for the kind of vision and strategy and leadership that any organization needs to thrive and to sustain itself. In 2017, we commissioned a national report alongside BoardSource, who was also looking at the nonprofit sector, to see what the leadership at the board level of museum organizations across the country looked at. Many of you participating in this call have seen this report and also participated in this report. So again, let me say thank you. I've also embedded the links for this report. It is good, and I should say motivating reading around the challenges and things that we can tackle in terms of expanding and adding some sophistication to our board leadership. But as it relates to what we're talking today, a couple of key findings and data points. One of the startling things that we uncovered, 46% of museum boards are all white. This is actually compared to 30% of nonprofit boards. So while the nonprofit sector as a whole is also struggling to create diversity among its most senior leadership, museums seem to be lagging behind a bit. But the good news also embedded in this report is that museum directors and board chairs believe that board diversity and inclusion are important. In fact, 64% of museum directors are dissatisfied with the board's racial diversity. And we see this reflected in things such as the participation that we're having in this call today. So while we do know that there is a challenge, there is renewed and new interest in attacking this challenge. In figuring out how far we have to go, the report also dug into awareness of the challenge versus the effectiveness of different strategies that we are putting in place. And what we found is that there is a significant disconnect between the director's impact recognition, meaning understanding, being aware of the fact that diversity and inclusion are an issue, and the urgency around solving that. Only 12% of the directors surveyed are satisfied with their board composition. This is very much in line with the slide previously that showed that we understand that this is an issue and want to work on it. 77% said that it is important to advancing the mission. So 12% are not satisfied, 3/4 are saying we actually have to do something about it because it's important to advancing our mission. But only 24 of those surveys said it's a high priority in board recruitment. So what we actually found is that we're having challenges translating our understanding of the problem and our desire to work through the problem with actually implementing tactics. This disconnect is a barrier to our sustainability and our relevance. We have been thinking about this on the ground level for nearly a decade now, about how museums can more comprehensively represent the communities that they serve and why this is important to our continued existence and impact. The Leading with Intent report was quite comprehensive, and we talked about many lenses of diversity and accessibility and inclusion. And what we actually found is that the widest area of disconnect and challenge was on racial and ethnic diversity. So I know some of you are familiar with the report, and the report resonates with different organizations in different ways. We did look at gender, we did look at accessibility, we did look at some of the other criteria that are also known to be challenges in the work of DEAI, but the widest disconnect and the largest challenges always seem to show up in racial and ethnic diversity. And that is where the American Alliance took its cue from. We decided we might as well head for the most challenging of the issues. Late last year, we stepped in and asked, all right, so what is the work to be done? How could we have been talking about this for so long and still have such challenges in moving forward? Is there any way we can distill some of the next steps? So we released the Facing Change report. And the Facing Change report included 5 particular insights around what must be done. And this report is exceptionally well written, a nice, easy read, and as kind and comprehensive and inclusive as the language is, it is one of the most challenging reports that the American Alliance of Museums has put out, because it makes clear that both personal and professional, and institutional work are simultaneously required to handle the challenges. So the first insight was around our personal development, around unconscious bias as individuals. The second insight calls into question something we all know we face, debates on definitions, completely stalling progress. The third insight reiterated that inclusion is central to our effectiveness and sustainability. The fourth insight is that we need to talk systematic change. There are institutional, some intentional, many unintentional barriers that hinder genuine progress. And last, and certainly not least, is that empowered, inclusive leadership is essential at all levels of the organization. And so with that, the American Alliance chose its first steps. And our first steps were to look at what we can do about museum leadership at its highest level, at the level of our board. And so in response to the Facing Change report and the Leading with Intent survey, we have launched the Facing Change Initiative, advancing museum board diversity and inclusion. The program will last for 3 years, specifically targets 5 cities and 50 museums, 10 museums in each of those cities. That is the museum community of learning. And throughout the 3 years, AAM will provide intensive, deliberate work to educate, coach, steward museums into broadening racial and ethnic diversity, with a stated goal of boards becoming more racially and ethnically diverse by the end of the program. Part of what we're also looking to do, because the interest is so high and the need is even higher, is in real time, we'll also be working to translate our learning outside of the 50 museums that are getting the intensive work. The kinds of insights that we can have, the types of learning that we can gather. One of the reasons that we're choosing 5 different cities and 10 different museums in each city is because while we all have common issues, common challenges, and perhaps a common vision for the good of museums in our world, we are unique organizations with unique challenges. One of the things we want to do is to be able to understand how those different challenges impact this conversation about museum board diversity. The American Alliance of Museums Board itself has been grappling with these issues over the last 20 years, and we have been successful in diversifying our board, but it has been a journey, a very deliberate one. We have had to make institutional changes, make cultural changes, and sort of think through this. All of this work, the wind beneath the wings, will be the 10 Facing Change Fellows, which is the program that we're giving the introduction to today, and the applications opened last week. So the role of the fellows will be multifaceted. Initially, and one of the primary things is that the fellows will help us facilitate baseline assessments of the cultural competency of the museums that are engaged in our community of learning. The fellows will be then assigned as coaches to museum boards and their senior leadership through a regimen of technical support and DEAI curriculum. That curriculum is being developed by the American Alliance of Museums along with consultants that work in the DEAI field. But over the course of the program, particularly in years 2 and 3, the insight and input of the fellows will begin to impact the curriculum, as the fellows actually serve as liaisons and advocates for the museums which they are coaching, and the conversations that they're having, helping us to understand the specific challenges. There are some very specific outcomes. We would like boards to have a board inclusion plan. One of the things that all of the reports have told us is that we need structures to support the ideas behind diversity. And so one of the things we will be developing are board inclusion plans, and this is also one of the skills that we hope translates to the broader field. Lastly, certainly not least, the fellows act as champions of the work of Facing Change. Active engagement and profiling in our online platforms as well as our print platforms, helping us think through sharing best practices, if not being the sharer of the best practices and other learning from the Facing Change program with the broader museum community. So this is the general scope of the role of the fellows. There are additional program elements. Some of you may be thinking, well, if I don't know how to facilitate a baseline assessment of cultural competency, does that mean I'm already out? Not necessarily. Part of what's incorporated into the fellowship program is the specialized training needed to support and facilitate the work that we're doing. While we are very interested and very excited about having applicants who have done significant work in this space, you will see when we get to priority criteria that what we're looking for is a cohort of fellows who bring different talents and different geniuses to the table. So some of the training and competencies needed for the role will actually be supported within the program. exceptional networking, the fellows themselves, as well as the members of the museum communities of learning and their boards as we do that work. Sponsored access to the AAM annual meeting, in addition to some of the more intensive training for the fellows occurring at the AAM meeting. In years 2 and 3, the fellows will be supporting the museums participating in the museum communities of learning, their training at our annual meetings, as well as celebrations of their success as well. And of course, the profile and exposure on AAM platforms in terms of talking about their work, their progress, their learning. That will also be an opportunity and a specific element that's included in the program. Time and travel commitment. So this is very interesting. We have designed the fellowship as a non-residential fellowship. We've had several questions related to that. I'm going to try to get to some of them here, but please ask additional questions if this is not clear. The fellowship runs the course of the initiative from May 2019 through May 2021. We're estimating a monthly commitment of 40 hours. Some of that work is going to be independent in terms of planning. Some of that work is going to be the monthly check-in calls. Some of that work is going to be engagement, phone calls with the CEO or the board chair or the board champion group that the fellow is working with. What we are trying to do is to give the fellows an estimate of the amount of time that they will be committing. However, a significant portion of that time will be very flexible, particularly when it comes to the time that fellows must prepare for particular activities. That is also included inside of that 40 hours. It is a non-residential fellowship, meaning we are not requiring people to move to either Washington, D.C., Arlington, Virginia, where the AAM headquarters is, or to reside near or next to the museums in the cohort of learning that the fellows are supporting. All travel to those places will be provided for and supported. One of the questions we got said specifically, it seems like the majority of the program is virtual. And I would say yes, to a large extent. However, by non-residential, we're specifically referring to folks not having to relocate to the Washington, D.C. area. If we think through the time commitment, the trips traveling to the museum communities of learning, as well as the trips traveling to the headquarters here in Washington, D.C., that is actually part of the fellowship. So it will probably break down to somewhere between 30% to 40% of the time will actually be touching base with your cohort in the fellowship, with your museum community of learning, at the annual meeting, or with us here in the Washington, D.C. area. But your proximity to us or to the museum is not a consideration, with the exception, unfortunately, that we are at this point only able to support people who are traveling within the United States. There will be regular trainings and orientations that will comprise a big portion of the trips to the Washington, D.C. area, as well as a lot of the time that is spent at the annual meeting. But some of those orientations will also be webinars and phone calls, and then also monthly check-ins. And the monthly check-ins are actually not to be underestimated. The work ahead is exciting, but I do think that the work ahead will also be challenging. And so we refer to the fellows as a cohort that we are prepared to support, and the fellows will also be supporting each other in terms of these check-in and these calls. And that is also the conduit for which we will begin to lay out priority issues that the curriculum designers need to take into account that the fellows are seeing are particularly challenging. So eligibility and selection. So I would note the phrasing of minimal as opposed to minimum eligibility restrictions. We are very open to non-traditional and bold candidates, as well as classic and perfect fit candidates for our fellows. We want to be as diverse and inclusive in selecting our cohort as we hope that our museum boards will also become. We did get a question about whether or not you need to be a U.S. citizen to apply for the fellow. What I will say to that is that you must be able to work and receive a fellowship in the United States. This is a grant-funded program, so the monies associated with the stipend for the fellows is associated with their restrictions. So if you have particular questions about that, definitely send us a note, give us a call, and we'll be able to relay those very specific questions to our funders to make sure that you are eligible to receive the fellowship. If you are an international student or resident here in the United States and are currently working or receiving some kind of fellowship or support, it is likely that the rules that apply in that circumstance will also apply in this. The next three bullets are actually a nod to folks who may think that they are not included as opposed to being things that you must be to be included. So both museum and nonprofit professionals across the board are welcome. Independent consultants who are in this space, for-profit or not-profit, are invited. And mid and advanced career professionals are also encouraged to apply. It may have been some time since you thought about being a fellow, but we do want a full range of diversity and participation within our cohort. So if you have a specific question or disqualifier, please send that. We've tried to be very inclusive and open to the types of folks that will apply. So that's eligibility. Let's talk about what we're really looking for and some of the priority criteria. Our priority criteria are centered around our goals and the biggest challenges that we anticipate. So first, of course, a demonstrated commitment to diversity and inclusion, however that is demonstrated and shown. A demonstrated ability to work with nonprofit boards, high-capacity volunteers, and/or executives. We have gotten questions about whether or not you have to be at a certain level in your organization. The level in your organization is not what is being evaluated. What we're actually looking for is the experiences and opportunities that you've had to work both with peers and superiors as we think through the special kinds of relationships that boards actually have with their organizations. We'd like to see experience in working with boards or other high-capacity volunteers, or even in other parts or aspects of your work where you're working with senior executives and that persona type, as those are often the types of people that sit on our board as well. Our fellows must be both self-directed and collaborative. Because it is a non-residential program, obviously folks will have assignments. Those assignments will be clear. That training will be clear and helpful, et cetera, travel. So there's a lot of self-direction there. But at the same time, these fellows will be working as a collaborative and as a cohort, and being able to share information, communicate across experiences, across cities, et cetera, will become vitally important. In particular, you may have already done the math and noticed that there are 5 cities and 10 fellows. It is likely that each city will have 2 fellows that are most actively working in those cities. And those fellows will become as much a team as the entire group will also become a cohort. So we're looking for folks who can work well independently, as well as work well in groups. Last and certainly not least, folks were able to communicate and present with some gravitas and authority that guide. These museums that join and apply to become a part of the museum communities of learning are asking to be guided. And so being comfortable with taking on that role, presenting in that way is key, as well as being open enough to stimulate conversation and learning. And so we've all been in those situations where there are certain teachers and consultants and leaders who inspire us to learn and to think and to have a conversation. And there are those that really sort of do not create that atmosphere. And in this space, this is really required. So thinking through that. And I would also say that this is part of all of these criteria, with the exception of the commitment to diversity and inclusion, are part of the way we're also looking to design the cohort. We expect some fellows to be much stronger in one priority criteria than another, and to be able to enhance and participate in the co-learning of the fellows alongside the co-learning of the museum. We also got a question, so I want to note here that the selection of the fellows is separate and apart from the selections of the museum communities of learning. The cities for the museum communities will be announced later this month. And the selection of the fellows and the selection of the museums participating is neither dependent nor exclusive. They're two very, very different processes, two very different applications, two very different sets of evaluations. So if you're wondering, oh my gosh, if my city is chosen, can I still apply? Yes. Oh my gosh, if my city is not chosen, can I still apply? Yes. Those are very separate processes and properties. We also have a question about if my CEO is already on the board of the American Alliance of Museums or is planning to participate in Museum Community of Learning, can I still apply? The answer is still yes. The processes are separate, and they are not mutually exclusive. I will not go so far as to say that the processes are blinded. We are not going to select all 10 fellows and the museum from one city and one organization. But I would say that there is no mutual exclusivity in that selection process. Last but not least, the applications are open. They will close on March 19th. Cover letter, CV, supporting materials, pretty standard. Everything is being submitted electronically. If I can back up a moment and say that each of the fellows will receive a stipend of $25,000 for their participation annually in the program. And that is meant as an acknowledgement of the work and effort that is being put in to the fellows. So back to the cover letter, the CV, and the supporting materials. One of the things that we wanted for this informational session to do is to help to guide, particularly in things you might talk about in the cover letter and the type of supporting materials you might want to share with us to give us a bigger picture of who you are and what you intend to bring to the table. And so with that, we are going to go into some of the questions that people are submitting right now, and we're going to try to get to as many of these questions as possible. But I want to note that the reason that the email appears more than once is if we do not get to your questions, or if you have follow-up questions once you've had time to think and sort of have a conversation, please email us and send us those questions. Some folks have already sent questions and gotten responses outside of this webinar and this process. Okay, so let's start with a few questions, specifically in terms of thinking through working and content for the fellows. So one of the questions is content timeline, thematic focus per month, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's a follow-up question to that. So the content and thematic timeline have not been determined yet. Part of what's going to inform that process are actually the museums that are participating in the museum communities of learning, as well as the 5 cities that are being structured. What we do know is that this first year, which will kick off in May, will primarily focus on cultural competency, recognition of bias, and understanding, quote unquote, where we are. So in the first year, the museums will be doing quite a bit of self-digging work and reflection. Some of the very soft stuff in terms of understanding personal experience and bias, and some of the very by-the-book stuff, which is looking at the numbers, the histories, the board governance processes that may be providing impact. And then a follow-up question is, will the curriculum exclusively focus on board? Or will it also work on sort of community-focused initiatives? This particular initiative really does focus on board work. The museum's relationship to the community will only come up as it relates to the way that the board is directing the institution. For example, and this is not related to racial and ethnic diversity, I formerly was a part of the Association of Science Museum Directors when I was the CEO of the Michigan Science Center. And one of the conversations we were having, for example, was whether or not we or our staff could officially participate in the March for Science, which you may think is a really interesting conversation for science centers to be having. But the reason that conversation was coming up was because we had to think through the culture of our board and how our boards would feel about such participation. And we had to balance that with community expectations. So those are the ways in which that conversation will come up, and that will likely be very institution and clearly very community specific. But we are really focusing on boards, not just because they can be a hindrance to certain things, but because really good boards can also be a help. Okay, and so I think we sort of clarified a bit about, so what museums will the fellows be working with? So the Facing Change fellows will be specifically tasked to supporting museums that are in the museum communities of learning. They are selected through their own selection process. However, we do not expect for the knowledge to be withheld from the rest of the community. So it is one of the things, for museum professionals, active museum professionals who are participating as fellows, we do expect a really good outcome to be raising the level of knowledge within the sector. We also expect for museum fellows to bring their own experiences about what is not happening in their own institutions to the table. And part of what the fellows will be trying to do will be helping AAM figure out how to translate some of this beyond just the 50 museums that are getting the hyper focus. And we do expect for the fellows to be thinking through their own museum experiences if they are currently part of a museum. We have a question here about whether or not people who are currently employed at a museum or in any other space, if you're currently employed, can you be a fellow? The Alliance itself will not have any restrictions on that, but at some point, we will ask for a confirmation that your supervisor and your institution is on board, participating as a fellow in terms of your travel and the amount of time that is required. And we do expect many institutions will recognize this as an incredible professional development opportunity and the talent that it will bring back home to them in terms of that. So on the other side of that conversation, we also have the question, can newly graduated students, current students, emerging museum professionals apply? So I would say go back to the priority criteria that we talked about. If you have these experiences, if you can bring this level of commitment to the table, I would say apply. I'm actually a very big proponent of taking the opportunity to apply, if for nothing else than to learn how to tell your story. And so I would say, again, we're not so much considering your level or the spaces that you work. We're looking at how you describe your commitment to diversity and inclusion, what kinds of experiences you've had. So say, for example, specifically newly graduated students. You were on the student council and were responsible for regularly communicating with deans. That is very similar to what we're talking about. So think through the different kind of experiences that you've had, and how they relate to the priority criteria and the way that you describe yourself. A very similar question was around, are you just looking for folks who would say maybe on the development team or specifically designed as a board liaison? One of our questions came from someone who was leading a diversity and inclusion task force within their own organization. I think that doing that kind of work clearly demonstrates that there has been work in the space that we're looking forward to, and particularly if you're working on a team or a task force that has to communicate out, right? That has to communicate up, or even has to communicate more broadly than the participation. That is also part of what we are talking about. And I want to encourage you to think about your experiences even outside of your daily work. Some of you are actually board members yourselves of different organizations, because there are other things that you care about. So being on the other side of the conversation can also be considered part of that experience. Let's see. Is there a concern if a fellow switches jobs during the process? So I would say that we can't predict such things. And what we would encourage fellows to do is to have a plan for that. The fellowship itself is not tied to where you currently are and what you currently do. We do not have any exclusion for who can participate in a fellowship. But obviously, as you move from position to position, your employer or your supervisor would be the one that would be where you would take that conversation. And if I can just sort of add kind of a word of negotiation advice, say it sort of during that process, not until they offer you the new job. Once they've decided that you're their top candidate. If you are one of our fellows, you can talk about the extraordinary training that you're getting, that you will also be bringing to the organization. So we have broader, let me do one more question on eligibility, then we're going to some broader spaces. I work for a federal agency. Am I eligible? Yes. As long as your agency doesn't have any restrictions about you receiving outside funding from another place or source, or this is a fellowship, then we would not have any restrictions on that ourselves. So we have a question, talk about the narrowness of where we're working with the grant. So if we're focused on racial and ethnic diversity, will accessibility be addressed? Gender, disability, and ability. So part of what we are looking at is having to have a diversity and inclusion conversation with communities, and by communities I mean that are unfamiliar with the conversation at all. And after a lot of conversation, picking an entry door is what we needed to do. And the entry door we chose was the one that was universally rated as the most difficult and the most daunting. That said, one of the things that all of the boards will have to do is design their own board diversity and inclusion plan for the board. And those plans are intended to be reflective of the institution and their community. And so what we're actually intending is to be able to use these conversations about how to be racially and ethnically inclusive, which has been rated as the most difficult, to be able to teach the skills to have the conversation about creating space for accessibility, for gender, for disability, for learning ability, and all of those different kinds of things. So the short answer is that we had to choose. So this is where our curriculum is going to be focused, where our efforts are going to be focused. The long answer is that focus is not designed to be exclusive. Frankly, if we have to go back in and have a conversation on inclusion every time you're trying to include a difference, we have actually missed the boat on explaining on what it is. That is a great, great question. And I would hope that it comes up every single month of the fellowship. Ooh, this is a great question. Are you looking to expand boards beyond those who can contribute? Thank you, development professionals and CEOs. So one of the things that we will be helping boards to look at is how they define what a good board member looks like. So we've got two categories of that. One, that classic time, talent, treasure, right? Even though it's a mantra, we need some folks who can contribute time, some talent, some treasure. Somehow we always get stuck on the treasure. That said, part of what we're also seeing is foundations or other grantors asking, what is the percentage of giving? Do you have 100% giving on your board? One of the things that we will be working with boards is to really unearth how they design their minimum giving expectations, how they design their time and responsibility expectations as well, so that we can think through that. At the end of the day, yes, boards are fiscally responsible, and boards are also supposed to financially contribute, but there is some unearthing to do in that space. Other side of that conversation is the assumption that certain members of your community cannot contribute. That is also one of the things that we will be unearthing. I myself am from a community that has a significant portion of wealth within communities of color, but we are still not represented on nonprofit boards in that community. And so part of that is also unearthing those assumptions about where we can find and how we can diversify, and whether or not we are shifting standards or if we are eliminating barriers. Will the fellowship be offered again next year? That is actually a really good question. Our goal is to be able to connect fellows and museums for the 3 years, so that the museums and the fellows can have continuity and to build trust for the difficult conversations that are bound to happen. What we do not have in place yet is a firm process by which we would replace fellows if for some reason a fellow had to leave the program and think through that. But I would say that if all goes well, the fellows will be in this space for all 3 years. However, we are also looking to use the Facing Change Fellows as a model for other fellowships that we would like to have in the future. Next year, probably too soon. Year after that, probably not soon enough. Okay, who do the fellows report to? The fellows report to the Director of Inclusion. Oh, what does the selection process look like? Thank you very much. So the selection process will be both an internal and semi-external panel, meaning internal group of folks who are working on the Facing Change in the American Alliance of Museums. And in addition to that, we will have representation from our board and from the diversity task force that is also associated with the Facing Change program. I will not go into detail, but the diversity task force is a selection of individuals who are going to be charged with figuring out how DEAI, the full scope of DEAI, is incorporated into our accreditation process and our continued excellence going forward. Okay. These folks are very active, so we're still doing questions here. Okay, wait, which one? Okay. So I am liking this continued question about digging into how boards are composed. So here's a question, will we examine and address economic gaps between board members? And think through those choices, et cetera. So one of the things that we will be asking from museums, and the fellows will also be researching, is the composition of their current board. So we will be looking at economic status, we will be looking at racial composition, we will also be looking at what I call veteran board members. We will be looking at things like terms and term limits and the lack thereof. So these are really good questions, and that comes in the evaluation of the institutional, unintentional, or intentional barriers to inclusion. Okie dokie, and so we've got several questions here that are coming together around. So I'm working at a museum. I've got a limited employment term. Am I still eligible? Do I need to be employed at a museum? If I work at a museum, will my museum automatically be part of the museum community of learning? And can you work a full-time job while doing the fellowship? So the answer to that question is, essentially, if you can, we can. So what we've laid out is thinking through, looking at this from 40 hours, essentially a week, sort of give or take, but not necessarily, all together, and there's some flexibility in terms of thinking through that time. So if you are currently employed at a museum, the way that this is likely to work for your museum is that the museum itself would consider this a paid professional development opportunity in which you were getting skills, potentially some advanced training, and thinking through diversity work, whether or not that has you directly working with to help diversify your board, or to help move a diversity and task force internally, or getting one started. If your employer is willing to share that time with us, we are more than willing to share your time with that employer. I would say that the fellowship is broken up in terms of half and half, in terms of time that is flexible and time that is scheduled. For example, the half-day, full-day sit-down in Washington, D.C. training, that cannot be moved according to individual fellows' schedules. But when your calls are scheduled with your museum that you are coaching, when your visits to the museum that you are coaching are scheduled, that actually can be worked around your schedule in collaboration, of course, with the museum and the board that you are working with. And that is one of the things that we'll be looking at when we're also doing the matching. So we have flexibility there. Again, the fellowship program is actually separate from the selection of the museum community of learning. They are not mutually exclusive, meaning if you get in one category, you can't get into the other category, and they are not tied together, meaning that vice versa is not true as well. And I talked specifically about having a full-time job at a museum, but that would apply to whatever organization that you are a part of. And as folks are thinking about whether or not they can manage, sort of even around the flexibility of the time, keep in mind that even as you are flexible in scheduling times and thinking through that, you are going to be working with another museum as well. So for example, you may be willing to work at 2 o'clock in the morning, but I'm not so sure that the board chair that you're attached to will want to receive that call at that time. And so we'll be working through that. But there is flexibility in any of, say, the non-physical training when the fellows are out supporting their museum, and we will continue to work with that. The other advantage there is that we are working with boards. These are exceptionally busy individuals. And because of that, that time in which a fellow is specifically tied down to a 2-day visit or 1-day visit will be quite limited because of the flexibility of the board. Okay, I want to be mindful, and I am looking for sort of new questions in different categories as we enter our last 4 minutes. This is a great question. Are the required travel dates available yet? The only required travel dates that are set are the annual meeting dates, because we know that at the annual meeting, there will be designated trainings for both the fellows and the museum. However, we also received a question very specific, a couple of questions to attending this particular annual meeting, and we're going to post and update that. So when we say that there will be training at the annual meeting, it is a given day during the annual meeting. So attendance at the entire annual meeting is encouraged and is considered an opportunity, but that is not required if a fellow has a conflict and cannot attend the entire meeting. The single day will be specified, and based on some of the feedback we're getting, we will look to have that specific day on the website for 2019 next week, so that folks can think through that. But allow me to say that before you eliminate yourself from application, if you think that there is something that bars you from applying, please send us a very specific question so we can talk very specifically through what your challenge might be, and let you know if that's something that we've anticipated or that we're already working through for other this, I think, is going to be a great question to end with. When will applicants be notified? So we are going to be reviewing very quickly, and we expect for applicants to be notified no later than April the 1st. And part of this is managing travel coming to May, to this annual meeting or that time, for those who are not already scheduled to go, and also thinking through it as people are giving us feedback around conflict with that time. So I want to thank everyone for your attention and your input. We've got several folks over here sending questions in the direction, and it is fine. We are actually still reading them and watching them. And so, of course, the direct email, if your question was still specifically not answered and you don't have what you need, facingchange@aam-us.org. And so I want to just close with a thank you for your interest and your commitment, and 3 sort of extra tips and insights as you think about how to deliver yourself on your application. We are bringing together a diverse culture. So do not be afraid to highlight and lean on your talents and your experiences. Think about the program, think about our core competencies, think about our priority criteria, and do not shy away about highlighting what you are exceptionally strong in and highlighting about the places that you are exceptionally interested in learning and growing, because we are looking for diversity within the cohort itself as well, because that's going to be required for us to process the learning. Remember that we have a 2-fold challenge. One, of course, is the diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion coaching and facilitation itself. And the second is the board coaching and facilitation, right? Some of that may be structural, some of that may be cultural, et cetera, et cetera. Both will be challenging, separated from each other. They're much more interesting together. Again, do not shy away from being very clear about where you are strong and what you're bringing to the table in either or both of those challenges. Last but not least, take advantage of additional materials. As you can imagine, this is also how we're getting to see who you are, how you talk, how you communicate. Don't be afraid to be creative in terms of communicating that. Those supplemental materials are optional. You do not have to fill up the entire 5 pages or whatever limit it is that we set, but do feel free that if you have something that you think really communicates the work that you've done, or even a team that you participated on or led, and you would like to share that work with us, be it a video, a brochure, a TED Talk, think creatively about how you can communicate the full view to us. So again, thank you very, very much for your participation. I don't know if any of you were watching the number of participants grow, but we did have about 100 folks on the line today, and I'm very excited about what we will be able to accomplish together. Thank you. Have a wonderful